This lesson of Introduction to Ethics, we're going to talk about what's called virtue ethics. Now, this view has its roots in ancient philosophy. It's primarily in the Western world associated with Aristotle. You saw in the text, there's also versions that are contemporary and also other ancient versions associated with Confucius and Buddhism, as well as with the Christian tradition. Now, if you recall from previous lessons, we can group at least the deontological ethical theories or duty-based theories and the utilitarian theories, which are a consequentialist kind of theory, based on what they take to be the most important thing in this kind of analysis. Virtue ethics is a bit different, and our text doesn't use this kind of graphic, but I think it's helpful a little bit to think about this and to think about, rather than the motive, to think about the person. So the focus is on the person who's doing whatever it is they're doing, but more on the kind of person they are, and what they do shows about who they are. And so when you talk about virtue ethics, you talk about traits of character, which are traditionally called virtues. So you talk about a person's character, who they are in a deep sort of way, the kind of things they do all the time. And so this will become more clear as we go. So it's the character traits of the person that are most important, and the acts and consequences will flow from this kind of person, as it were. So a virtuous person, a person of good moral character, will tend to do actions that are morally good, that are morally virtuous acts. They will tend to do things that result in the kind of consequences that are good consequences, that are beneficial to others or to themselves. Now, the word virtue means a trait of character that makes someone good. It's the traits that make you a good person. Now, many are listed in this section. I'm going to talk in the next slide about what are called the cardinal virtues, but a lot of them are mentioned, and we can think about when we describe someone as a good person, we will often say, well, he or she is honest, they're trustworthy, they're loyal, they're dependable. These are things we might say. They have a strong sense of justice. They're very courageous. They don't back down from adversity. They're very tenacious. A lot of things we would use. They persevere in the face of adversity, that kind of thing. And we would say these kinds of things about someone, and we'd use them to describe them as a good person. And in the tradition, these are called virtues. Now, the word virtue comes from the word vir, spelled V-I-R, which is a Latin word for manliness, or being a manly man in a certain sense, but in a sense of being a mensch, if you're familiar with the Yiddish term, when someone says "be a man" about it. But of course, as you know, a lot of stuff that comes from the ancient world on it and through the modern era, there's a bit of a gender bias that's sort of built in, and we'll talk about that some in the next lesson. But the word that Aristotle would have used, and the other Greeks like Plato and Socrates, etc., would have been the word arete, which is a Greek word which means excellence. So it's an idea that these are excellences of character. These are excellent traits to have. People who have them are good people, and not only that, one of the core ideas is that not only does having them make you a morally good or a good person, they also enable you to live a good human life, to flourish, to do well in life, and to be happy, and on a certain understanding of what happiness is. On this view, happiness just is being a virtuous person who has that kind of life. Now, Aristotle, talks about the virtues, and later on these, the cardinal virtues were singled out as being the most important one. And cardinal comes from a word that means hinge. These are supposed to be the ones that you have to have in order to have a good human life and in order to be a good person. And you can think about this as we go along, and later when you have assignments that deal with this. you can think about, okay, are these really important? Do you have to have these to have a good human life? Do you have to have practical wisdom? This is the idea here of prudence is, knowing what you should and shouldn't do in a certain sense based on what the facts are, that you understand what the facts are about a situation, and you look at them carefully before making a decision. You don't necessarily leap into something without having thought it through first. Next, there's the idea of justice, this sense that people should get what they deserve. Say if you were hiring somebody and they work for you, you'd pay them a fair wage. You'd give them what they deserve. And if someone wrongs you in some way, you would think that, well, they should be punished in a certain way, again, to get what they deserve. But no more than they deserve, and perhaps no less than they deserve, unless maybe you also have the virtue of mercy, which might conflict a little bit with justice. But the idea is that you have a strong sense of right and wrong, and that people get what they deserve, good and bad. Then there's temperance or self-control, and this is not just in regards to, say, drugs or alcohol, but also in terms of your sex drive, that you don't act in such a way that it's not self-control when it comes to sex, or your anger. This was very important for the Greeks. If you're familiar with the story of the Iliad, it was his lack of self-control which led Achilles to act out in such a way that caused a lot of problems. Again, spoiler alert, well, you can see the movie Troy, or read the Iliad, or a summary of it if you're curious as to the trouble that came from Achilles' anger, which was, again, his lack of self-control, or moderation, it's often called by the ancients. And then finally, there's courage. And again, this view has its roots in the ancient world, and sort of military courage was their sort of paradigm of what a courageous person is, someone who faces fear and acts in the face of it. Now Aristotle in the text talks about this idea of virtue being a mean between extremes, like it's a middle ground. And that works for a lot of these. It doesn't work for all of them, and there's a question of whether it's actually a good way to think about them. But courage is a good one when you think about someone who is, if you're not afraid of anything at all, then you lack the kind of wisdom to know which things you should be afraid of. And if you're afraid of everything, then you would have the vice of cowardliness. And vice is just a name we give for the lack of a virtue, or an extreme in one way or the other. So courage is facing the fear and acting, but knowing which things should be rightly feared and how the right way to respond to them is. And you can see how these virtues would be related to one another. But the way we, typically people who talk about virtue ethics nowadays think of courage, they don't think of it just as military courage, but any kind of courage, standing up for your beliefs, standing up to a bully maybe, but not necessarily with violence, but just telling the person that this is unacceptable, or standing up and stating your beliefs about maybe an unpopular political position, that you think that something that's going on is wrong, and you stand up and talk about it. And this is showing courage that isn't just physical courage, although it's certainly related to that. Now, the classic tradition of virtue, as I said before, is that there's this idea that I alluded to this, and it's related to the natural law theory that we covered in a previous lesson. And the idea that humans are a certain way, and there's a certain kind of life that's a good life for a human being. And that, according to the virtue view, to be able to realize this kind of good, flourishing human life is to require the virtues. You need justice and courage and temperance and prudence and maybe a lot of other ones in order to have a good, flourishing human life. Now, the text talks about other virtues besides moral virtues. This is a class on ethics, so we're primarily focusing on what we call the moral or ethical virtues. But the idea that to have a good human life and to realize the natural ends of human beings, which is to have this flourishing life, the Greek word is eudaimonia, or a eudaimonistic life, is to have these traits. And so people who are self-controlled have better lives and more good human lives than people who aren't self-controlled. And you can see how this could work out, right? People who overindulge in alcohol or drugs or sex or anger even may tend to not have as good a life in the long run, and that people who do, and people who are prudent, and people who are just and honest, and what other virtues you want to put in there, kindness, mercy, etc. You could make your own list of or what are the character traits I think are a good person, you can ask yourself, do people who have those traits have better lives than people who don't? And that's a question for the theory. So one of the main criticisms of the virtue approach is that it doesn't tell us exactly what we should do in a certain situation. It may just say, well, do the virtuous thing. One of the ideas that comes from the virtue tradition is this idea of a moral role model, a virtuous person that we could look to, an exemplar, an archetype that we would look to and say, well, do what that person would do. You see this in the Christian tradition with the "what would Jesus do" sort of catchphrase, right? So, well, this is our model of a really good person, in fact, the best person, and you should do what he would do. For the ancient Greeks of Aristotle's time, it might have been Socrates. We'd say, well, what would Socrates do in this situation? And for the Buddhists, it might be, well, what would the Buddha do in this kind of situation? And so it doesn't give you a recipe for exactly what anybody should do in that same situation, but it does say that given the circumstances, given who you are, and given everything else, you should act the way that person would act. It may not tell you one exact right thing to do. Now, whether this is a criticism of the theory, saying, well, it's not specific enough, or it's a pun intended, a virtue of the theory, that it gives you some room to say, well, many actions might be the right one to do as long as they're done, from a point of view of good character. And some other criticisms of the theory are brought up. I'm not going to dwell on those. Some of the same ones that maybe apply to natural law theory. There's a tendency to maybe think that people don't really have these traits of character. And then there's criticisms that come from the other traditions. Again, you can look at that in the text. I'm not as concerned as we're going through this course with presenting theories and then criticizing them, which you would if it was a moral theory class, as much as saying, okay, this is a way to think about ethics and a way to think about ethical decision making and how we talk about it. We talk about it in terms of traits of character. We talk about it in terms of the good life. And so that's the important thing to keep in mind, that this is more of our arsenal or our toolkit for talking about ethics and for reasoning with others and getting into discussions with others about ethical matters and important issues. So that concludes our lesson on virtue ethics.